My husband planted a vacuum-sealed bag of white powder in my suitcase, hoping to get me locked away in federal prison so he could steal everything I had worked my entire life to build. So I slipped the package into his secretary's designer luggage instead. When the Transportation Security Administration agent pulled it out at the airport checkpoint, my husband lost his mind on the spot. He thought it was just a harmless decoy, a simple prank to ruin my life. What he did not know was that the powder inside the bag was very real, and his perfect little mistress was running a massive illegal operation right under his nose. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who mistook your silence for stupidity. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, I learned early on that security was something you had to build for yourself. My parents worked tirelessly just to keep the lights on, and they instilled in me a work ethic that bordered on relentless. By the time I was 34 years old, I had become a highly sought-after forensic accountant. I spent my days analyzing corporate fraud, tracking missing assets, and dismantling financial lies for multi-million-dollar firms. I was trained to notice discrepancies, to find the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. Yet for years I had actively ignored the massive glaring discrepancies in my own marriage. Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport is a chaotic, sprawling beast of a building, and on that particular Tuesday morning, it was packed with travelers rushing toward their departure gates. I stood quietly in the expedited security lane, dressed in a tailored emerald green pantsuit, observing the scene unfolding 2 lanes over in the standard security line. My husband Terrence stood there, looking like the absolute picture of black excellence he so desperately wanted the world to believe he was. He wore a custom-fitted navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a gold watch that I had paid for. Next to him was Jasmine, his 25-year-old secretary, shifting impatiently in her expensive stilettos and repeatedly flipping her long bundles of hair over her shoulder. Terrence had told me he was flying down to Miami for a critical technology sales conference. He claimed Jasmine absolutely had to accompany him to manage his hectic itinerary and handle corporate client relations. He thought I was flying out of a completely different terminal heading to Sedona for a solo wellness retreat. He thought I was blind. He thought I was just the quiet, supportive wife who paid the mortgage on our luxury downtown condo, funded his extravagant lifestyle, and asked 0 questions to preserve his fragile ego. Terrence loved the image of being a self-made corporate vice president, but the reality was that I carried the financial weight of his entire existence. I paid off his business school loans. I bought his luxury vehicles. I quietly supported his manipulative mother, Brenda, and paid the bills for his lazy older brother, Andre, who sat around all day making excuses. I shrank myself to let Terrence shine, believing that was what a good supportive partner was supposed to do. My repayment for years of unyielding loyalty came the night before our respective flights. Because of my profession, packing a suitcase is a methodical, precise process for me. I know exactly how much my luggage weighs, and I know exactly where every single item is placed. When I did a final check of my belongings late last night, I noticed a subtle bulge in the interior lining of my suitcase. Taking a small seam ripper, I carefully opened the fabric and extracted a heavy vacuum-sealed brick of white powder. My heart had stopped in my chest, but my analytical mind immediately took over. Terrence had purchased cheap baking soda and flour, sealed it tightly, and planted it in my bag. His plan was brutally simple. He wanted me detained by airport security for hours, perhaps even days, while they tested the suspicious substance. That window of detention would give him exactly enough time to execute his plan to drain our joint bank accounts, freeze my access to our assets, and leave me with absolutely nothing while he slipped away with his secretary. Instead of screaming or confronting him, I had calmly walked down the hall to the guest room where Jasmine had carelessly left her overnight bag after dropping off Terrence's travel documents earlier that evening. I unzipped the side compartment of her flashy monogrammed duffel and shoved the brick of powder deep inside. I wanted him to feel the exact panic he had intended for me, Back in the present moment at the airport, I watched like a hawk as Jasmine hauled her oversized carry-on onto the conveyor belt. She flashed a brilliant flirtatious smile at the security agent, while Terrence stood behind her holding his iced latte, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was likely calculating exactly how many minutes it would take for me to be arrested at my terminal. I saw the exact second the security agent's eyes narrowed as he stared at the X-ray monitor. The conveyor belt jerked to a sudden halt. The agent pressed a button under his console, and two armed airport police officers immediately stepped out from behind a partition, moving swiftly toward the screening area. They approached the belt and pulled Jasmine's monogrammed bag aside. "Excuse me, miss, is this your luggage?" the lead officer asked. Jasmine's brilliant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer terror. "Yes. Why, what is wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling so badly it was audible over the ambient noise of the terminal. The agent unzipped the designer carry-on, reaching deep into the side compartment. He pulled out the massive vacuum-sealed bag of dense white powder and placed it heavily on the stainless steel inspection table. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed across the entire terminal, causing dozens of travelers to stop and stare. Terrence dropped his iced latte. The plastic cup hit the floor, shattering and splashing cold milk and coffee all over his expensive leather shoes. The rich brown complexion of his face turned an unnatural shade of ash gray. He stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He whipped his head around, frantically scanning the crowd until his eyes locked onto me. I was standing safely on the other side of the expedited checkpoint, my hands folded neatly over my leather purse, watching him with absolute composure. "What did you do?" he screamed across the security barriers, completely ignoring the armed officers who were now surrounding his secretary. He lunged toward the divider, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. A massive security agent immediately tackled him by the shoulders, slamming him hard against the metal tables to keep him contained. Terrence struggled wildly against the agent's heavy grip, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She did this," he yelled to the police. "It is her fault she put that in there." I stood my ground, slowly sliding my designer sunglasses down the bridge of my nose before speaking. My voice was calm, measured, and carried easily over the surrounding commotion. "I just repacked Terrence," I said smoothly. "You always told me I was far too disorganized." Terrence stopped struggling for a fraction of a second, letting out a forced, desperate laugh that sounded borderline manic. "It is a joke," he yelled to the officers, sweat pouring down his forehead. "It is a prank. It is just baking soda and flour, I swear to God. My wife is crazy. She is trying to frame us because she is jealous. Just test it, please. Just test the powder right now and you will see it is completely fake." The lead police officer ignored his frantic shouting and snapped on a pair of blue latex gloves. He took a small narcotics testing kit from his belt and used a pocket knife to slice open the corner of the vacuum-sealed bag. We all watched in silence as the officer dipped a chemical swab into the thick white powder and then placed it into a small vial of testing liquid. Terrence was still panting, still trying to convince the officers it was a harmless domestic dispute gone wrong. Then the clear liquid inside the testing vial instantly turned a bright, unmistakable shade of deep blue. The officer looked up, his expression hardening into absolute stone. He turned to face Terrence and Jasmine, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. "Sir, this is not baking soda," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious register. "This is pure cocaine." The silence that followed was deafening. Terrence froze completely, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. The bag he had planted in my room was supposed to be a harmless decoy purchased from the baking aisle of a grocery store. He had absolutely no idea that his beautiful, entitled 25-year-old mistress was running her own highly illegal operation right under his nose. The bag the security agent pulled out was not my repackaged baking soda. It was her actual real stash that she had packed herself to distribute in Miami. Jasmine fell to her knees right there on the airport floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the metal handcuffs clicked loudly and tightly around her wrists. She looked up at Terrence, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup, and screamed for him to do something to use his corporate money and executive power to save her. Terrence could not even formulate a sentence. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine of his own making, realizing too late that his entire life was about to be blown to pieces. I turned my back to the chaos, my posture perfect, and walked calmly toward my departure gate, leaving my husband to face the devastating consequences of his own monumental arrogance. I did not even make it to my departure gate before two Transportation Security Administration officers intercepted me. They were polite but firm, instructing me to accompany them to an airport holding room for questioning. I did not argue. I simply adjusted my silk scarf, handed them my boarding pass, and walked with the posture of a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide. The holding room was exactly as sterile and uninviting as one would expect. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the scratched metal table bolted to the center of the floor. Terrence was already there, pacing the length of the small room like a trapped animal. His custom navy blazer was wrinkled, and his expensive leather shoes were still stained with dried milk and coffee from his dropped latte. Jasmine was seated in the corner, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, theatrical sobs. Two police officers stood near the door, holding clipboards and looking entirely unimpressed by the display. The moment I walked through the door, Terrence stopped pacing and pointed a shaking finger at me. "Officer, this is the woman you need to arrest," he demanded, projecting his voice from his chest in that authoritative corporate tone he practiced in the bathroom mirror every morning. I am a vice president of sales at Vanguard Solutions. I am a respected professional in this city. This woman is my wife, and she has a documented history of being bitter, unstable, and deeply jealous of my professional relationships. She planted those narcotics in my secretary's luggage to frame us because she cannot handle my success. I took a seat opposite him, crossing my legs at the ankles, and rested my hands in my lap. I let him speak. I let him weave his desperate, pathetic narrative. For years, Terrence had sold this exact story to his family, his friends, and anyone who would listen. He loved playing the role of the self-made pillar of Black excellence who was burdened by an unsupportive, difficult wife. He was banking on the officers looking at me and seeing the stereotype he was trying so hard to project: an angry, irrational woman driven by spite. He thought his polished vocabulary and his job title would automatically grant him credibility. One of the officers, a tall man with a graying mustache, turned his attention to me. "Ma'am, your husband is making a very serious allegation. He claims you had access to his secretary's luggage last night and that you have a motive to sabotage his business trip. How do you respond?" I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply opened my designer handbag and pulled out my wallet. First, I placed my heavy metal platinum corporate credit card on the table, letting the solid clink echo in the quiet room. Next to it, I placed my federal identification badge. "Officer," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. "My name is Camille. I am a licensed forensic accountant and a senior auditor for a firm that handles federal contracts. I am also the sole primary breadwinner of my household. Last year, I legally declared a gross income that is exactly 3 times what my husband earns at Vanguard Solutions. I pay the mortgage on our luxury condo. I pay the lease on his imported car. I even pay the utility bills for his mother's house." I leaned forward slightly, making direct eye contact with the officer. "I track missing millions for a living. I build airtight cases against corporate embezzlers. I assure you, if I wanted to ruin my husband's life, I would not resort to amateur hour tactics like stuffing a brick of cheap narcotics into a counterfeit designer bag." Terrence's jaw dropped. The veins in his neck bulged as he struggled to comprehend that I was exposing our financial reality in front of strangers. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but the officer held up a hand, silencing him immediately. The officer looked down at my credentials, his demeanor shifting from suspicious to highly attentive. "You mentioned the bag was counterfeit," the officer noted. I glanced over at Jasmine's monogrammed duffel bag sitting on an evidence cart near the door. The stitching on the handles is uneven, and the hardware is coated plastic, not brass, I explained easily. My husband's secretary makes $45,000 a year. She drives a Mercedes she cannot afford and carries bags she buys out of trunks. But if you really want to know how a girl on a clerical salary affords pure cocaine, you should not be talking to my husband. You should be looking at her cell phone. Jasmine's head snapped up. Her tear-streaked face morphed into an expression of absolute terror. Check her text history with the contact saved. As Miami cousin, I instructed the officers, keeping my tone strictly professional. As the person who pays the cellular family plan bill, which Terrence insisted on putting his secretary on to save money, I regularly review the data usage reports. Jasmine has been using an encrypted messaging app, but she occasionally forgets to turn off her cellular data backup. There are hundreds of data packets linking her phone to a known distribution hub in South Florida every single Thursday night. She was not traveling to Miami for a technology conference. She was traveling to re-up her supply. The room fell dead silent. Terrence looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, finally realizing that the quiet, compliant wife he had taken for granted was a phantom. I was not stupid. I was simply observant, taking meticulous notes while he paraded his arrogance around our home. The second officer immediately walked over to Jasmine and demanded she unlock her phone. Jasmine refused, clutching the device to her chest and sobbing louder. The officer easily confiscated the phone from her hands, placing it into a clear evidence bag. "We can get a warrant for the data extraction," he stated flatly. "But based on the physical evidence found in her possession, that will just be a formality." Jasmine realized in that exact moment that the game was over. She looked wildly at Terrence, her eyes pleading. "Terrence, do something," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Tell them you will hire your corporate lawyers. Tell them you will pay my bail. Do not just stand there. You promised you would protect me." Terrence shrank back against the wall. He had absolutely no power here, and more importantly, he knew he had no money to save her. He could not afford a high-powered defense attorney without asking me to write the check, and that was never going to happen. He looked away from her, staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by his own cowardice. When the officers hauled Jasmine up by her arms to formally read her Miranda rights, she lost whatever remained of her composure. She thrashed against their grips, screaming curses at Terrence, calling him a weak, broke fraud who lied about his wealth. Her screams echoed down the sterile hallway as they dragged her out of the holding room, leaving Terrence alone with me and the lead investigator. Terrence was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving as he stared at the empty space where his mistress had just been standing. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and fear. "You set me up," he hissed, stepping toward the metal table. "You knew about her, and you let me walk right into this trap." "I never told you to put your hands in my luggage, Terrence," I replied coolly, packing my credentials back into my handbag. "You tried to dig a grave for me, but you forgot to measure the depth. Now you get to lay in it." Before Terrence could muster another pathetic defense, the heavy metal doors of the precinct burst open with a loud, jarring crash. The noise echoed off the cinder-block walls, halting any further conversation. Standing in the doorway, breathless and vibrating with self-righteous indignation, was Brenda, my mother-in-law. She was dressed in her Sunday best, complete with a wide-brimmed church hat, clutching her oversized Bible as if it were a weapon. Right beside her was Chloe, my white sister-in-law, wearing her usual expensive activewear and an expression of pure, unfiltered hostility. They had clearly rushed straight to the airport the moment Terrence made his panicked phone call, ready to tear me apart to protect the golden child of the family. The heavy metal doors of the precinct burst open with a loud, jarring crash that echoed sharply off the cinder-block walls. The noise halted any further conversation in the interrogation room. Brenda entered first. She was a woman who treated every public space like her own personal pulpit. She wore an oversized lavender church hat that practically clipped the doorframe and clutched a thick leather-bound Bible against her chest like a shield. "Lord Jesus, deliver us from this wickedness," she wailed, throwing her head back and closing her eyes in theatrical agony. She marched right past me, her own daughter-in-law, and threw herself toward the holding cell area where Terrence had just been questioned. "My baby," she cried out, her voice vibrating with manufactured grief. "The enemy is trying to tear down a good, successful black man, but we will not let the devil win today." I watched her display with absolute zero emotion. Brenda had never liked me. I was too quiet, too focused, and worst of all, I saw right through her. I knew the lavish tithings she gave to her church every Sunday to maintain her status as the matriarch came directly from the checking account I solely funded. But Brenda was only half the problem walking through that door. Right behind her was Chloe. Chloe was married to Terrence's older brother, Andre. She was a white woman who had spent the last 7 years treating her proximity to a black family as some kind of cultural merit badge. She marched into the interrogation room wearing a crisp white tennis skirt, a fitted zip-up jacket, and an expression of pure, unadulterated hostility. She did not go to the holding cell to comfort Terrence. She made a beeline straight for me, her jaw set tight. Chloe stopped 2 feet from my chair, crossing her arms and glaring down at me. "What is exactly wrong with you, Camille?" she demanded, her voice loud and grating enough for the uniformed officers in the hall to hear. "Terrence called us crying. He told us what you did to Jasmine. You planted illegal drugs in that poor innocent girl's bag just to embarrass your husband at the airport." I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I did not speak right away, which only seemed to infuriate Chloe more. "You are so incredibly toxic," Chloe continued, taking a step closer and aggressively wagging her manicured index finger inches from my face. "You have always been jealous of Terrence. You are jealous of his success, his natural charisma, and now you are clearly jealous of his beautiful young assistant. You could not stand seeing him thrive, so you had to ruin his critical business trip. You are acting exactly like the stereotype Camille. You are being the bitter, angry, unsupportive black woman who wants to drag her husband down instead of lifting him up." The audacity of her words hung heavily in the stale precinct air. The lead investigator, who had just returned to the room, paused by the door, raising his eyebrows at Chloe's culturally tone-deaf and highly offensive rant. Brenda, hearing the commotion, abandoned her post by the holding cell. She turned around and nodded her lavender hat vigorously in agreement. "Tell her, Chloe," Brenda shouted from across the room, waving a hand in my direction. "Tell her the truth. She has never known how to respect a providing man." A providing man. The irony was so overwhelmingly thick you could choke on it. I did not yell. I did not match Chloe's frantic, aggressive energy. I did not give them the loud, angry reaction they so desperately wanted to capture and use against me. Instead, I simply reached into my leather handbag and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and calmly opened my real estate investment portfolio application. "Chloe, since you have so much to say about how I treat this family and how I supposedly manage my husband's success, I think it is time we discuss your current living arrangement," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chillingly conversational tone. Chloe scoffed, tossing her blonde ponytail over her shoulder. "What does my house have to do with you being a petty, jealous wife?" I tapped the screen, bringing up the property deed for the sprawling 5-bedroom house in Alpharetta. The house where Chloe and Andre hosted their lavish summer barbecues. The house Chloe constantly bragged about on social media, showing off her massive chef's kitchen and heavily landscaped backyard. "It has absolutely everything to do with it," I replied, taking a measured step toward her and holding the phone up so she could clearly see the illuminated screen. "You love to talk about family values, Chloe. You love to lecture me on supporting the men in this family. But you conveniently forget that your husband Andre has not held a steady-paying job in 4 years. You forget that the massive down payment for that beautiful house in Alpharetta did not come from Terrence, and it certainly did not come from Andre. It came directly from me." Chloe's eyes darted to the digital document on the screen, and her arrogant expression began to visibly falter. "The mortgage is solely in my name under my private limited liability company," I explained, swiping smoothly to the next screen to show the financial ledger. "I pay the property taxes every single year. I pay the expensive homeowners association fees. I even pay for the luxury landscaping service that trims those beautiful hedges you love taking aesthetic pictures in front of. I have let you and Andre live there rent-free for years because Terrence begged me to help his brother get on his feet. But my charity to this family ends today. I looked directly into Chloe's widening, terrified eyes and pressed a single green button on the real estate application. I just officially listed the property for sale, I stated clearly, watching the blood drain from her face. The market is incredibly hot right now in Alpharetta. My agent expects cash offers by tomorrow morning. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your entire performative lifestyle and vacate the premises. Chloe went completely pale, looking like a ghost in expensive athletic wear. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her chest began to heave as she started hyperventilating, taking short, panicked gasps of recycled precinct air. 30 days, she choked out, her hands gripping the edges of her jacket. You cannot do that. We have nowhere to go, Camille. You cannot just throw your family out on the street. I thought I was just a bitter, unstable wife, I replied calmly, slipping my phone back into my handbag and snapping the clasp shut. You should probably ask your providing brother-in-law to buy you a new house since he is so wildly successful. Brenda rushed over, grabbing Chloe's arm to steady her. You wicked, vindictive woman, Brenda hissed at me, her eyes blazing with furious indignation. God will strike you down for doing this to your own flesh and blood. Before I could offer Brenda a sharp reminder about her own heavy financial dependency on my income, the heavy doors of the precinct swung open once again. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from chaotic to utterly tense. Terrence strutted into the interrogation room looking completely different than the sweating, panicked mess he had been 20 minutes ago. His posture was straight, his shoulders were pulled back, and that familiar, deeply arrogant smirk had returned to his face. Right behind him stood a stern man in a sharp gray suit, one of the rapid response criminal defense attorneys retained by Vanguard Solutions. The corporate legal team had clearly swept in, thrown their considerable weight around, and managed to temporarily extract their vice president of sales from the immediate fallout of his secretary's arrest. Terrence was officially cleared to leave while Jasmine sat in a federal holding cell, taking the absolute fall for the narcotics. Terrence walked right past his hyperventilating sister-in-law and his fiercely praying mother. He stopped directly in front of me and slammed a thick manila folder down onto the metal interrogation table. The sharp slapping sound echoed loudly, shutting everyone else up instantly. Go ahead and sell the Alpharetta house, Camille, Terrence said, his voice dripping with intense condescension and newfound, unearned confidence. Sell it for cash. Sell it to the highest bidder on the market. It does not matter what you do with that property anymore. He tapped his knuckles aggressively against the cover of the manila folder. I filed for divorce yesterday afternoon, he announced, his voice booming loud enough for his mother and Chloe to clearly hear every word. Brenda gasped, pressing her hands to her chest in theatrical shock, while Chloe stopped gasping long enough to stare at Terrence in sudden awe. I knew you were going to try something crazy eventually, Camille, Terrence continued, leaning over the metal table to get directly in my face. You have always been too smart for your own good, but you are not as smart as me. The exact moment I filed those papers yesterday, I executed a total financial freeze. I locked down all of our joint bank accounts. I suspended the shared investment portfolios, and I legally redirected all of your incoming business deposits into a contested court escrow account. He stood back up, buttoning his navy blazer with a sickening look of absolute triumph. You think you hold all the cards just because you make more money than me? He sneered, looking me up and down. You think you can threaten my family and throw my brother out on the street? But you cannot touch a single asset until a judge divides our estate, which will take years of litigation. I have an entire team of ruthless corporate lawyers behind me, and you do not even have access to your own checking account to buy a cup of coffee. You do not have a dime to your name, Camille. You are completely broke. Terrence stood there panting slightly, his chest puffed out in his tailored suit as the echo of his declaration bounced off the precinct walls. He had just delivered what he believed to be the ultimate death blow. He expected me to shatter, to drop to my knees, and beg to dissolve into a puddle of tears right there on the scuffed linoleum floor. He expected the quiet, compliant wife to finally realize she had been completely outmatched by his corporate brilliance. Chloe, who had been hyperventilating only moments before, suddenly caught her breath. The color rushed back into her face as she looked at Terrence with newfound worship. Brenda actually clapped her hands together, letting out a sharp, triumphant sound that bordered on a holy shout. "Praise the Lord," Brenda declared, stepping forward to grip her son's shoulder. "A providing man always finds a way to protect his own." Terrence smiled, a cruel twisting of his lips that made him look like a stranger. He straightened his lapels, clearly emboldened by the presence of his mother and sister-in-law. He took a step closer to the metal table, placing his palms flat on the surface and leaning into my space. He wanted to make sure I heard every single syllable of his grand master plan. "You really thought you could control me?" Terrence sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought just because you handled the spreadsheets and paid the bills that you held the power in this marriage? But I am a vice president, Camille. I negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts for breakfast. Do you honestly believe I would let a glorified human calculator dictate my future?" I remained seated, my face a completely blank canvas. "Go on, Terrence," I said softly. "Tell me all about your brilliant financial strategy. I am genuinely fascinated." He mistook my calm demeanor for shock. He thought I was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. Emboldened, he began to pace the small interrogation room, gesturing wildly as he laid out his masterpiece. "I have been preparing for this moment for 8 months," he bragged, pacing back and forth. "You were so busy buried in your audit reports, so obsessed with tracking down other people's missing money, that you never even noticed what was happening in your own checking account. Every time I closed a deal, every time I received an executive bonus, I siphoned the funds. I did not put it in our joint savings. I funneled it through a series of shell companies I set up under Jasmine's name." He paused, waiting for a reaction. When I gave him none, he continued, his voice growing louder, more boastful. "We have been moving the cash offshore, Camille, to the Cayman Islands, a secure private account that your little IRS badge cannot touch. I transferred the last $200,000 yesterday morning, right before I filed the divorce papers. The joint accounts are locked. Your credit cards are going to start declining by this afternoon. You are going to be left with the mortgage on that downtown condo you love so much, and absolutely zero liquid cash to pay for it." Brenda stepped up beside him, her chest puffed out with toxic maternal pride. She looked down at me, her eyes filled with a lifetime of resentment that she was finally allowed to vocalize. "You brought this on yourself, Camille," Brenda stated, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You have nobody to blame but the woman in the mirror. For years I watched you disrespect my son. I watched you put your career, your firm, and your ambition above your duties as a wife. A man like Terrence needs a woman who knows how to nurture his legacy. He needs a woman who wants to build a family." Brenda pointed an accusatory finger at my stomach. "You refused to give him children. You prioritized your promotions over giving me grandchildren. You walked around our family gatherings acting like you were better than us just because you paid for the catering. You emasculated him, Camille. You made him feel small. What did you expect a strong black man to do? He found a young, beautiful woman who respects him. Jasmine knows how to treat a providing man. She knows her place. Terrence had to secure his future with a real woman." Chloe chimed in, nodding vigorously. "Exactly, Camille. You pushed him to this. You cannot be a cold, unfeeling, career-obsessed robot and expect a man to stay loyal. He is taking back what rightfully belongs to him." Terrence chuckled, wrapping an arm around his mother's shoulders. "Jasmine is just going through a little misunderstanding right now," Terrence said, brushing off his secretary's arrest for trafficking pure cocaine as if it were a minor traffic ticket. "My corporate lawyers are pulling some strings. They will have her bail posted by dinner time. Then she and I are taking a private flight to the islands. We are going to start over with the $2.5 million I safely secured. You can stay here and figure out how you are going to pay the electric bill." The sheer level of delusion vibrating in that room was almost suffocating. Terrence truly believed he had outsmarted a licensed forensic accountant. Brenda truly believed her son was a righteous victim. Chloe truly believed her housing crisis had been magically resolved. They stood united, a toxic triad of entitlement expecting me to break. Instead, I slowly stood up. I pushed the metal chair back, allowing it to scrape loudly against the floor. I reached for my designer wool coat draped over the back of the chair and calmly slid my arms into the sleeves. I buttoned it with precise, methodical movements. I picked up my leather handbag and snapped the gold clasp shut. "You are quiet now," Terrence mocked, taking a step toward the door to block my exit. "Nothing to say. No threats about selling houses. Where is all that boss energy you had 10 minutes ago, Camille?" I stopped directly in front of him. I did not look angry. I did not look defeated. I looked at him with the cold, clinical pity one reserves for a specimen in a laboratory. I slowly raised my left wrist and pushed back the cuff of my coat, exposing the platinum face of my luxury watch. I tapped the glass face lightly with my manicured fingernail. "It is exactly 10 o'clock in the morning in the Cayman Islands." "Terrence," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "The offshore banking sector has been open for a full hour. You might want to pull out your phone and check your balance." Terrence frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. I did not explain. I simply stepped around him smoothly, bypassing his mother and his sister-in-law. I reached for the heavy metal handle of the precinct door. "Have a wonderful trip to the islands, Terrence," I said without looking back. "And good luck paying Jasmine's bail." I pushed the door open and walked out into the busy hallway of the police station, leaving them standing in the interrogation room. The heavy door swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Brenda's voice. I walked purposefully toward the exit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. I did not rush. I did not look back. I simply walked out into the crisp Atlanta morning air, breathing in the sweet scent of absolute victory. Inside the interrogation room, the silence was sudden and heavy. Terrence stared at the closed door, his heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The absolute certainty in my voice had pierced through his arrogance like a surgical scalpel. He swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Terrence, baby." "What is she talking about?" Brenda asked, her voice losing its righteous edge, replaced by a sudden tremor of doubt. "Why is she acting like that?" Chloe crossed her arms, rubbing her elbows nervously. "Just check your phone, Terrence," she urged. "Prove that crazy woman wrong so we can get out of here." Terrence quickly shoved his hand into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out his smartphone. His fingers were shaking slightly as he unlocked the screen. He navigated past his standard banking applications and opened the encrypted application for the offshore trust account. The account he had spent 8 months meticulously filling with stolen funds. The account that represented his entire future with Jasmine. The application prompted him for his biometric authentication. He pressed his thumb against the sensor. A small loading circle appeared on the screen, spinning slowly against a dark blue background. Terrence held his breath. Brenda and Chloe leaned in over his shoulders, their eyes glued to the illuminated screen. The loading circle vanished. The account dashboard flashed onto the screen. Terrence's jaw went slack. The blood vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His knees physically buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of the metal interrogation table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. A low, strangled noise escaped his throat, sounding like a man who had just been punched in the chest. Brenda let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping her leather-bound Bible directly onto the dirty floor. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes widening in pure horror. There, on the bright digital display under the heading of Available Balance, the offshore account that was supposed to contain $2.5 million read exactly $0.00. The heavy precinct doors swung shut behind me, sealing away the frantic gasps of my sister-in-law and the theatrical prayers of my mother-in-law. The crisp morning air felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. My private town car was waiting exactly where I had arranged it, with the engine idling smoothly. The driver opened the rear door and I slid onto the pristine leather seats, adjusting my emerald blazer and instructing him to head toward the city center. I had not even settled fully into the quiet luxury of the back seat before my phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the interior of my handbag. I did not need to check the caller identification to know exactly who it was. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation vibrating through the device before sliding my finger across the screen and raising the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the sound of Terrence hyperventilating on the other end of the line. When he finally found his voice, it was a pitch I had never heard him use before, a shrill, panicked shriek that completely shattered his carefully cultivated facade of corporate masculinity. "You hacked me!" Terrence screamed, the audio peaking and distorting through the speaker. "Put the money back right now, Camille, or I swear to God I am calling the authorities. I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation for wire fraud and grand larceny. You think you are so smart, but you just committed a massive federal crime. You transferred $2.5 million across international borders without my authorization. They are going to lock you away in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life. Do you hear me? Put my money back right now." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that seemed to echo through the quiet cabin of the town car. The sound of my amusement only enraged him further, and I could hear Brenda in the background of the call demanding to know what was happening, while Chloe continued to sob hysterically about her impending eviction. Terrence was losing his grip on his family, his mistress, and his fabricated wealth all at the exact same moment, and the realization was driving him completely unhinged. "You are throwing around a lot of impressive legal terminology for a man who is currently standing in a police precinct with his mistress in a holding cell," I replied, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "Let me correct your fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. I did not commit wire fraud. I did not hack your heavily encrypted offshore accounts, and I certainly did not steal your money." Terrence stopped screaming, his heavy, ragged breathing filling the silence on the line. I leaned back against the leather seat, watching the city skyline approach through the tinted windows. "I did not steal it, Terrence," I stated clearly, enunciating every single syllable. "I audited it. My firm was hired by your chief executive officer 6 months ago to look into some very concerning inventory discrepancies at Vanguard Solutions." I heard a sharp, frantic intake of breath on the other end of the line. I continued my surgical dissection of his life, not allowing him a single second to recover. "You see, Terrence, when Vanguard noticed that their regional sales numbers were not matching their quarterly expenditure reports, they brought in external forensic accountants to trace the leaks. They brought in my team. And what I found was truly fascinating. I found a vice president of sales who was creating phony vendor accounts, inflating expense reports, and funneling corporate kickbacks into a web of shell companies. Shell companies that were conveniently registered under the name of a 25-year-old secretary named Jasmine. For 6 entire months, Terrence, I sat across from you at our custom dining table, eating the dinners I paid for, smiling at your condescending remarks, all while tracking every single fraudulent invoice you submitted. I watched you buy Jasmine a Mercedes with Vanguard's supply chain budget. I watched you fund Chloe's ridiculous lifestyle with corporate retention funds. You were so busy treating me like an ungrateful burden that you never realized I was the architect of your impending destruction. You thought you were so brilliant." I continued, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "You thought you were siphoning your own performance bonuses and hiding marital assets from me in preparation for your big dramatic divorce. But you were incredibly sloppy. You commingled the funds. You mixed whatever actual money you earned with the millions you were actively embezzling from your own employer. When you arrogantly froze our joint accounts yesterday and legally claimed that offshore trust as your sole separate property in your divorce filing, you essentially signed a legally binding digital confession of corporate theft." Terrence was completely silent now. The background noise of his mother and sister-in-law had faded away, leaving only the sound of his absolute terror. "You did not steal my money, baby," I whispered into the receiver, delivering the final fatal blow. "You stole theirs. And as the lead auditor on the Vanguard account, it was my legal and fiduciary obligation to secure those stolen assets. I legally transferred every single dime you embezzled back into a corporate holding trust controlled by your employer. The money is gone, Terrence. It is back in Vanguard's possession where it belongs. I ended the call without waiting for a response, letting the silence settle over me like a warm blanket. I placed the phone back into my handbag and instructed the driver to take me to the office. Back inside the precinct, Terrence stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, the phone slowly slipping from his sweat-slicked fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, the screen fracturing into a dozen jagged pieces, but Terrence did not even blink. His mind was racing a mile a minute, colliding with the terrifying reality of his situation. He had zero liquid cash. His bank accounts were frozen. His offshore safety net had been legally seized and completely drained. He had absolutely no way to pay Jasmine's exorbitant bail, leaving the woman he had promised to protect sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades for narcotics trafficking. But the complete lack of bail money was not even the most pressing nightmare crashing down on him. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over his entire body as he remembered the calendar. The Vanguard Solutions annual executive gala was in exactly 3 days. The chief executive officer, the board of directors, and every major shareholder would be in attendance. Terrence was supposed to be the keynote speaker standing on stage to accept an award for his regional sales performance. Now he realized with absolute gut-wrenching certainty that the CEO already had the complete audit report. The executives already had their stolen millions safely back in a holding trust. 72 hours from now, he was expected to walk into the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton wearing a bespoke tuxedo to shake hands with the very men he had been robbing blind. He had no money to flee the country. He had no leverage to negotiate. He had isolated his wife, dragged his family into a severe financial crisis, and publicly allied himself with a drug trafficker. If Terrence could not find a way to intercept the final fallout before that corporate gala, he was not just going to lose his prestigious job. He was going to be publicly destroyed, humiliated in front of the entire corporate world, and sent directly to federal prison. By the time my private car pulled up to the sleek glass entrance of my downtown luxury condo, my pulse had completely settled into its normal, steady rhythm. The ride from the precinct had given me exactly 30 minutes of uninterrupted silence to decompress. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the grand lobby. The marble floors gleamed under the ambient lighting, and the familiar scent of expensive sandalwood filled the air. This building was my sanctuary. I had purchased this penthouse entirely on my own 3 years ago, keeping it as a private asset, far away from Terrence and his fragile ego. He hated coming here because it was a towering monument to my financial independence. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed my key fob against the scanner. The doors slid shut, and I rode up to the top floor in total peace. When the elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, I stepped out and tossed my keys onto the silver console table. I walked straight to the kitchen island, pouring myself a tall glass of sparkling water with a slice of lemon. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Everything was perfectly in its place. Then the intercom buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound that completely shattered the tranquility of the room. I walked over to the wall panel and pressed the speaker button. "Yes, Marcus," I asked, addressing the downstairs concierge. "Ms. Camille." "I am so sorry to disturb you," Marcus said, his voice tight with professional panic. "A woman claiming to be your mother-in-law just pushed her way past the security desk. She tailgated another resident through the access doors and forced her way into the service elevator. We are sending security up to intercept her now." I let out a slow, measured breath. "Tell security to stand down, Marcus," I instructed calmly. "Let her up. I will handle this." Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy service door adjacent to my kitchen swung open. Brenda stumbled into my home, looking absolutely nothing like the polished, self-righteous church matriarch who had stormed the police precinct earlier that morning. Her oversized lavender hat was completely gone, exposing flattened hair that had lost its expensive volume. Her Sunday-best suit was wrinkled, and her heavy breathing echoed loudly across the open floor plan of my living room. She stopped in the center of the kitchen, gripping the edge of the marble island to physically support her weight. She stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. The anger I had seen in her earlier was completely extinguished, replaced by a raw, desperate terror. Camille, you have to fix this, Brenda gasped, clutching her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. You have to call whoever you called and undo this right now. Terrence is talking about going to federal prison. He is talking about the chief executive officer finding out about the money. You cannot let this happen to my son. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, savoring the crisp chill of the lemon. I did not offer her a glass. I did not offer her a seat. I simply watched her hyperventilate in my immaculate kitchen. I did not do anything to your son, Brenda, I replied, my voice echoing slightly against the high ceilings. Terrence embezzled millions of dollars from his employer to fund a secret life with a drug trafficker. I simply did my job as a forensic auditor. I returned stolen property to its rightful owner. Your son built his own cage. Now he gets to sit in it. Brenda slammed her hand against the marble countertop, her heavily ringed fingers making a sharp cracking sound. You are his wife, she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. You stood before God and a congregation and took holy vows to support that man through better or worse. This is the worst, Camille. This is when a real woman stands up and protects her family. You cannot just sit up here in your ivory tower and watch him burn. She began to pace back and forth across the hardwood floor, waving her arms frantically as she launched into a full-blown guilt trip. She was pulling out every single emotional manipulation tactic she had spent decades perfecting. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family legacy? Brenda wailed, stopping to point an accusatory finger at me. Do you have any idea how the church community will judge us if Terrence falls from grace? He is a pillar of the community. He is a shining example of Black excellence. Young men in our neighborhood look up to him. They see a vice president in a custom suit, and they believe they can achieve greatness too. If you let the authorities take him down, you are not just destroying a man. You are destroying a symbol. You are tearing down Black excellence because you are too bitter and too selfish to forgive a simple mistake. A simple mistake. The sheer audacity of her phrasing was almost impressive. Terrence had maintained a 6-month affair, plotted to abandon his marriage, attempted to steal millions, and allied himself with a cocaine smuggler. To Brenda, it was just a minor misstep that required a dutiful wife to clean up the mess. You need to unfreeze those assets immediately, Camille, Brenda demanded, stepping closer to the island, her eyes pleading. You are a smart girl. You know how to move money around. You know how to hide things. Transfer the money back to the offshore account so Terrence can pay off the company and make this disappear before the gala. Save your husband. Save our family name. I let her finish. I stood completely motionless, allowing her words to hang in the quiet air of my home. I looked at this woman who had spent years insulting me, undermining my career, and demanding that I shrink myself to make her deeply insecure son feel bigger. She was now begging me to commit a federal crime to save the very man who had plotted my absolute ruin. Brenda, your definition of Black excellence is deeply flawed, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper. You praise a man who drives a leased luxury car funded by corporate theft. You applaud a man who wears expensive suits bought with stolen money. That is not excellence, Brenda. That is a cheap, fragile illusion. And I refuse to sacrifice my freedom, my integrity, or my hard-earned license to maintain your delusions. Brenda let out a dramatic sob, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. How can you be so cold, she wept. How can you stand there and turn your back on the very church community that embraced you? The congregation will know what you did. They will know you abandoned your husband in his hour of need. I slowly set my water glass down on the counter. I walked over to the sleek built-in drawer system beneath the kitchen island. I pulled it open and retrieved a thick legal folder. I placed the folder flat on the marble surface and deliberately slid it across the island until it stopped exactly 1 inch from Brenda's trembling hands. Open it, I commanded. Brenda looked at the folder with heavy suspicion. She sniffled, wiping her nose with a tissue from her pocket before tentatively reaching out and flipping the cover open. She stared at the crisp, legal document inside. Her eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page. She read the property address. She read the holding company name. Then she read the signature line. Her breath hitched. She looked up at me, her expression transforming from desperate sorrow to absolute unadulterated shock. That is the official property deed to the new church community center. I stated clearly, watching the realization physically crush her posture. The same community center that you so proudly cut the ribbon for last month. The same building where you sit on the executive board boasting about your charitable fundraising. Brenda's mouth opened, but she could not speak. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. You see, Brenda, the pastor, was terrible at managing funds, I explained, walking slowly around the island to stand directly across from her. The church was facing total foreclosure last year. They were going to lose the community center to the bank, so I bought it. I purchased the entire property under my private limited liability company to save the congregation from losing their gathering place. I paid the property taxes. I funded the renovations. I let you take all the credit and put your name on the brass plaque by the front door because I did not care about the glory. I only cared about the community. I leaned in, resting my hands on the marble, looking directly into her terrified eyes. But you marched into my home today to disrespect me, I whispered dangerously. You marched into my sanctuary to demand I commit a felony to protect a thief. You tried to use your church standing as a weapon against me, so let me make something incredibly clear to you. I tapped my index finger sharply against the legal document. I own the ground you prey on, Brenda. I own the building where you hold your meetings. If you do not turn around, walk out of my home, and leave this property in exactly 5 seconds, I will evict the congregation by Friday. I will bulldoze that beautiful new building, and I will turn it into a commercial parking lot. Brenda stumbled backward as if I had physically struck her across the face. The holy roller facade, the manipulative tears, the demands for legacy, all of it completely vanished. She was left staring at a woman who held absolute total control over her entire social existence. I counted my voice echoing in the silent kitchen. Brenda let out a high-pitched, terrified whimper. She spun around, her expensive heels slipping wildly on the hardwood floor as she scrambled toward the heavy service door. 2. I continued. She slammed her hand against the exit button, shoving the heavy door open with all her body weight. She did not look back. She practically fell into the service corridor, her sobbing echoing down the hallway as the heavy metal door swung shut behind her. I stood alone in my kitchen, the silence wrapping around me once again. The air felt lighter. The lingering stench of Brenda's hypocrisy was fading away. I reached out and calmly closed the manila folder, sliding it back into the drawer. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a long, refreshing sip. Just as the glass left my lips, my cell phone lit up on the counter. The screen illuminated with a bright notification banner. It was an urgent text message from Andre, my soon-to-be former brother-in-law Chloe's husband. I picked up the device and read the message displayed on the screen. Chloe just got arrested. What did you do? I stared at the bright screen of my smartphone resting on the marble kitchen island. The notification banner hovered there for a few seconds, displaying the frantic text from my brother-in-law. Chloe just got arrested. What did you do? The sheer audacity of the question was almost impressive. Before I could even reach out to tap the screen, the message vanished, replaced instantly by an incoming phone call from the exact same number. I picked up the device and answered, swiping the green icon and pressing the phone to my ear. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply listened to the absolute chaos erupting on the other end of the line. Camille, what the hell is going on? Andre screamed, his voice cracking with a level of panic I had never heard from him before. There are federal agents in my house. They just kicked the front door open. They are tearing apart the living room. They have dogs sniffing through the garage, and they just put my wife in handcuffs. They dragged Chloe out to a black government vehicle right in front of the entire neighborhood. What did you do to us? I took a slow, calm sip of my sparkling water. The contrast between my quiet, sunlit penthouse and the violent destruction of their suburban illusion was incredibly satisfying. I strongly suggest you lower your voice, Andre. I replied, my tone completely even and devoid of any sympathy. First of all, I did not do anything to your wife. I have been sitting in my own kitchen drinking water. Second of all, if federal agents are currently executing a search warrant on your property, you are barking up the wrong tree by screaming at me. You should probably be asking your wife what she has been doing with her free time. She has not been doing anything illegal. Andre shouted, his heavy breathing echoing through the phone. She runs her lifestyle boutique. She sells imported candles and organic linen spray. She is a small business owner, Camille. You set her up because you are mad at Terrence. You planted something in her business accounts to frame her, just like you framed Jasmine at the airport. I actually laughed aloud at that. The sound was sharp and echoed in my empty kitchen. The utter delusion of this entire family was staggering. They truly believed they were criminal masterminds when in reality they were just sloppy, greedy amateurs. Andre, you have not held a steady-paying job in 4 years, I stated, laying out the cold, hard facts. Your wife sells $60 lavender candles on the internet. Yet somehow, you two drive matching luxury SUVs, take quarterly vacations to the Bahamas, and wear designer clothing that costs more than my monthly car payment. Did you honestly believe that selling a few dozen candles a month was funding that lifestyle? Or were you just too comfortable playing the role of a kept man to look at your own household ledger? He fell silent for a long moment. I could hear the heavy thud of boots moving around his house in the background. The sound of federal agents tearing through the expensive drywall and custom cabinetry that I had personally financed. What are you talking about? Andre finally asked, his voice dropping to a trembling whisper. His arrogant bravado was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that his entire world was built on a massive lie. I am talking about money laundering. Andre, I explained, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looking down at the busy city streets below. Jasmine was bringing in pure narcotics from Miami, but she had a massive problem. She had a mountain of dirty cash and absolutely no legitimate way to deposit it into the banking system without triggering a federal alert. She needed a clean, legitimate business front to wash the money. She needed a business that routinely handled varied cash transactions and had a flexible inventory system. The realization hit me exactly when it should have. The missing puzzle pieces snapped together with perfect mathematical precision. Chloe had always been incredibly defensive about her boutique's finances. She refused to let anyone in the family look at her sales numbers, claiming she wanted to keep her business strictly independent. Your wife provided the perfect laundromat. Andre, I continued, spelling it out for him as if I were speaking to a slow child. Jasmine handed over the dirty street cash. Chloe created fake purchase orders for phantom boutique inventory. She deposited the drug money into her business accounts, masking it as retail sales, and then funneled the clean money right back to Jasmine, taking a hefty percentage for her trouble. That is how your wife afforded her country club memberships. She was the financial spin cycle for a South Florida narcotics ring. No. Andre gasped, a pathetic whimpering sound escaping his throat. No, Chloe would not do that. She does not even like Jasmine. She thinks Jasmine is trash. People will tolerate a lot of trash when it pays for their mortgage, I replied coldly. Or at least the mortgage they thought they were paying before I listed the house for sale this morning. But how did they find out? Andre pleaded, his voice breaking. How did the feds get a warrant so fast? If they have been doing this for months, why are they raiding my house today? This was the most delicious part of the entire situation. The perfect absolute irony of Terrence's monumental ego destroying his own family's criminal enterprise. You can thank your brilliant providing brother for that, I said, resting my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Terrence thought he was a financial genius. He thought he could execute a hostile takeover of our marital assets by freezing all our joint accounts and aggressively moving funds to the Cayman Islands. But Terrence does not understand forensic banking algorithms. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet reality of my victory wash over me. When Terrence initiated a global freeze on my accounts yesterday, he accidentally triggered a massive chain reaction across the entire banking network, I explained. The federal banking system has automatic safeguards in place under the Bank Secrecy Act to prevent sudden, massive movements of hidden wealth. When Terrence tried to lock me out, he flagged his own social security number. That automatic flag immediately alerted the Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I could hear Andre swallowing hard on the other end of the line, the sheer scale of the disaster finally sinking in. The federal systems did not just look at Terrence, I continued, They deployed an automated forensic sweep of every single bank account tied to his name, his network, and his family. They looked at your accounts, Andre, because Terrence used his corporate Vanguard funds to give Chloe the initial seed money to start her fake boutique. Your wife's business accounts were historically linked to your brother's digital footprint. When the feds scanned Chloe's boutique ledger, they saw massive, erratic cash deposits that completely violated federal structuring laws. Terrence basically pointed a giant neon sign at your wife's money laundering operation. He handed her to the federal government on a silver platter. There was a long, agonizing silence on the phone. I could picture Andre standing in the ruins of his heavily financed suburban mansion, watching the life he never actually earned being packed into cardboard evidence boxes. The irony was exquisite. Chloe had marched into the police precinct just an hour ago, wagging her finger in my face, calling me toxic and unsupportive. Now she was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle wearing handcuffs, facing decades in prison for racketeering and money laundering. Camille. Please. Andre finally spoke, his voice reduced to a pathetic broken whisper. They are taking her away. They are seizing the cars. They are seizing everything in the house. I do not even have money for a taxi to get to the federal courthouse. I am completely locked out of the accounts. He took a ragged, trembling breath. I know Chloe was terrible to you today. I know my mother said awful things. But you have to help us. You are the only one with clean money. You are the only one who understands how these legal systems work. I need to hire a defense attorney. I need to post her bail before they process her into the federal holding facility. Please, Camille, I am begging you. We are family. You have to send me the money for her bail. I stood there in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, looking out over the city I had conquered through my own hard work and unrelenting discipline. I thought about the years I had spent tolerating their disrespect. I thought about the dinners I had funded, the bills I had paid, and the constant quiet humiliation of being treated like a secondary citizen in a family of broke, arrogant frauds. They had demanded my silence. They had demanded my money. And they had demanded my absolute submission to their twisted definition of loyalty. I lifted the phone slightly, adjusting my grip. My voice was calm, steady, and completely empty of mercy. Try Uber, I said. I ended the call. The heavy reinforced door of my downtown condo clicked open with a sharp metallic thud that echoed through the quiet hallway. I had deliberately disabled the primary audible alarm system directly from my phone 20 minutes prior, leaving only the silent high-definition interior cameras running. I knew exactly who was turning that copied key. I knew exactly what he was coming to find. From the dark corner of my home office, I sat perfectly motionless in my oversized leather armchair. The late afternoon sun had dipped behind the adjacent high-rises, casting the room into deep slate-colored shadows. I held a crystal glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, resting it casually on the armrest. I did not make a sound. I simply listened to the frantic, heavy footsteps moving rapidly across my imported hardwood floors. Terrence was not sneaking. He was tearing through my sanctuary with the destructive panic of a cornered animal. I heard him rip open the console drawers in the foyer, sending keys and mail scattering across the floor. I heard his ragged, uneven breathing as he moved down the corridor. He genuinely believed I was still sitting in a boardroom at Vanguard Solutions, finalizing the audit reports that were actively dismantling his life. He thought he had a window of opportunity to erase his sins. He burst into my home office, hitting the door so hard the handle punched a dent into the drywall. The sheer state of him was pathetic. The custom-tailored suit he had worn so proudly to the precinct that morning was completely ruined. His tie was gone, his collar was ripped open, and dark patches of sweat soaked through the expensive fabric of his shirt. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant vice president who had spent 6 months treating me like an incompetent burden. He looked like a man who knew he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. He did not even notice me sitting in the shadows. He launched himself directly at my sleek glass desk. He began yanking drawers open with violent force, dumping my perfectly organized client files onto the floor. He swept a stack of industry magazines off the edge, sending them crashing against the baseboards. He was muttering to himself a frantic stream of profanities and desperate pleas as he searched for my primary work laptop or any external hard drives. I watched him destroy my workspace for a full 60 seconds. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, savoring the rich, dark vintage on my tongue. I reached over to the smart panel on the side table and pressed the master switch. The recessed ceiling lights blazed to life, instantly flooding the office with bright, unforgiving illumination. Terrence froze. His hands were buried deep in my bottom desk drawer, and his entire body went rigid. He snapped his head up, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He looked like he had just seen a ghost materialize in the center of the room. I smiled, resting my wine glass on my knee. I reached into the pocket of my emerald blazer and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. I held it up between my index and middle finger, letting the metallic casing catch the bright overhead light. "Looking for this, Terrence?" I asked, my voice smooth and chillingly calm in the ruined office. He stared at the drive and then back at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to process my presence. His shock rapidly mutated into a volatile, explosive anger. He slammed the desk drawer shut and took a heavy step toward me, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You set her up!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking under the strain of his panic. "Andre just called me hysterical. Federal agents raided their house. They dragged Chloe out in handcuffs right in front of the entire neighborhood. You planted something in her boutique accounts. You fed the government false information to ruin my family because you are a bitter, vindictive woman." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I remained comfortably seated in my leather chair, crossing my legs with deliberate, slow grace. "I did not set up anyone, Terrence," I replied, enunciating every single syllable with surgical precision. "I did not force Chloe to launder drug money through her fake lifestyle boutique. I did not force Jasmine to import narcotics. And I certainly did not force you to embezzle millions of dollars from Vanguard Solutions to fund their entire criminal enterprise. I simply let the system work." He took another step forward, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. "I am your husband," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive register. "You took vows to protect me. You are supposed to be on my side. Give me that drive, Camille. Give me the drive and give me the passwords to the Vanguard servers so I can wipe those audit files right now. If you do not hand that over, I am going to federal prison. They are going to take everything." I gestured casually toward the upper corner of the ceiling. A small red light blinked steadily from the discreet security dome mounted above the doorway. "You are currently standing in my privately owned residence after breaking and entering," I noted calmly. "You have destroyed my property. You are actively confessing to corporate embezzlement. And now you are physically threatening the lead forensic auditor investigating your crimes. You are building a spectacular case for the prosecution, Terrence. I highly suggest you lower your voice and step back." He did not step back. The logic and reason that usually governed his corporate mind had completely evaporated. He was operating entirely on blind survival instinct. He looked at the silver USB drive in my hand, like a starving man looking at a meal. He genuinely believed that tiny piece of hardware was the only thing standing between him and a concrete cell. "You think you are so brilliant, Camille?" he sneered, his upper lip curling with pure malice. "You think you can just sit there and destroy my life, and I am just going to let it happen? I built you. I gave you the lifestyle you have. You were nothing before you married me. You are going to give me that drive, or I swear to God I will tear this place apart and take it from you." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound seemed to infuriate him even more. "You built me," I repeated, shaking my head in absolute disbelief. "You leased a luxury car you could not afford. You bought a suburban house with a mortgage that was quietly drowning you. You funded a mistress using stolen corporate retention bonuses. You did not build anything, Terrence. You are a hollow, fragile shell of a man who played dress-up with other people's money. I bought this penthouse with cash. I built my firm with my own intellect. You spent the last 6 months treating me like a naive housewife while I mapped out every single fraudulent invoice you ever signed. Terrence let out a guttural roar of absolute rage. He lost whatever tiny shred of control he had left. He lunged across the space separating us, throwing his entire body weight forward. He knocked my heavy crystal wine glass out of my hand, sending it shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of dark red liquid. He grabbed my wrist with bruising force, twisting my arm as he violently snatched the silver USB drive from my fingers. He stumbled backward, breathing heavily, gripping the small drive in his sweaty palm. A triumphant, ugly smile spread across his face. He looked down at the drive, panting like he had just won a marathon. "You lose, Camille?" He gasped, his eyes wide and manic. "I am going to smash this into pieces. I am going to melt it down. You have no proof. You have nothing. I am walking out of here and I am fixing my life." I did not scream when he grabbed me. I did not react to the shattered glass at my feet. I simply smoothed the lapel of my blazer and looked up at him with a cold, hollow smile. "You can swallow that drive whole for all I care, Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a dead flat whisper. "It is completely blank. It is a decoy I bought at an office supply store for $12. His triumphant smile instantly vanished. He stared at me, his jaw dropping slightly as the horrible reality of my words began to penetrate his panic. "You are a vice president of sales, Terrence." I continued, standing up slowly from the leather chair to face him directly. "You work in a corporate environment. Did you honestly believe a senior forensic auditor would keep the only existing copy of a massive federal embezzlement case on a single unencrypted flash drive in her home office? You really are an amateur." His hands began to shake. He looked down at the silver drive and then back at me, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. "Where are the files, Camille?" he demanded, his voice trembling with unchecked terror. "Where is the audit report?" "It is exactly where it belongs," I replied, straightening my posture and looking down on him both literally and metaphorically. The digital files were uploaded directly to the secure servers at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at 8 o'clock this morning. But I knew the Vanguard Board of Directors needed a physical, certified copy of the complete dossier to initiate your immediate termination. I took a slow step toward him, forcing him to back away from my desk. "I did not want them to read it in a boring morning meeting," I explained, a sharp, vindictive edge creeping into my voice. "I wanted the delivery to match the absolute devastation you brought into my life. So I hired a highly secure bonded private courier. I gave him very specific delivery instructions." Terrence shook his head, stepping backward until his shoulders hit the wall. "No," he whispered. "No, Camille, please." "The Vanguard Solutions annual executive gala is this Friday," I stated, watching the blood completely drain from his face. "The entire board of directors will be there. Every major shareholder will be seated in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. You are scheduled to be the keynote speaker, Terrence. You are supposed to walk up onto that stage in a custom tuxedo and accept your award for regional sales performance." I leaned in, closing the distance between us until I was inches from his terrified face. "My private courier is scheduled to arrive at the Ritz-Carlton exactly halfway through the gala," I whispered fiercely. "He is instructed to walk directly to the head table and hand the sealed audit dossier directly to your chief executive officer right as you step up to the microphone. The CEO is going to open that file and read your complete digital confession of corporate theft while you are standing on stage under the spotlights." Terrence let out a strangled, broken sob, sliding down the wall until he collapsed onto his knees amidst the scattered papers and shattered glass. "You wanted to be the center of attention, Terrence," I said, looking down at his ruined, sobbing form. "You wanted everyone to witness your excellence. Now they will. They are all going to watch you burn." Terrence stumbled out of the polished glass doors of my luxury building and hit the bustling downtown sidewalk like a man who had just been thrown from a moving vehicle. His chest heaved violently as he desperately sucked in the humid afternoon air. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the pavement. It was exactly 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. The Vanguard Solutions annual executive gala was set to begin with a cocktail reception at 7 o'clock sharp. He had exactly 3 hours to intercept a highly secured private courier at the Ritz-Carlton before a certified dossier of his federal crimes was handed directly to his chief executive officer. Terrence leaned heavily against a concrete planter, pulling his phone from his pocket with violently shaking hands. He opened his banking applications one by one, praying for a glitch, a system error, or a miracle. The screens loaded with terrifying consistency. The joint checking account was frozen. The corporate expense account was locked. The offshore trust account displayed a brutal red zero. Camille had completely financially neutralized him. He caught his reflection in the mirrored glass of a nearby storefront and let out a strangled groan of despair. He looked like an absolute madman. His custom-tailored Italian suit, the one he had worn to project power and dominance at the police precinct, was completely destroyed. The collar was ripped, the silk tie was gone, and dark purple stains from my shattered wineglass splattered across his white dress shirt and the expensive gray wool of his trousers. Security at the Ritz-Carlton would never let him through the front doors looking like a violent vagrant. He needed a tuxedo to blend in with the Vanguard executives. He needed to be invisible long enough to stake out the grand ballroom entrance and physically intercept the courier before the package reached the head table. But he had absolutely no cash, no credit, and no leverage. A wave of pure adrenaline-fueled panic washed over him. He ripped his prized luxury watch from his wrist. It was a massive gold timepiece he routinely flashed during board meetings to assert his dominance over the junior sales executives. He sprinted 3 blocks down the avenue, bursting through the doors of a high-security pawn shop. He slammed the heavy gold watch down on the glass counter, demanding $2,000 in immediate cash. The pawnbroker did not even flinch. He calmly picked up the watch, screwed a jeweler's loop into his eye, and examined the face for exactly 10 seconds. Then he slid it back across the glass counter with a dry, humorless chuckle. "I can give you $200 for the scrap metal value," the pawnbroker stated flatly. "The casing is plated and the internal movement is a cheap overseas knockoff. It is a high-tier replica, buddy, not a genuine piece." Terrence felt the blood drain from his face. The watch was a fake. His entire image of wealth and corporate invincibility was a carefully constructed fraud, and now the universe was stripping it away piece by piece. He snatched the $200 from the counter, swallowing his pride and sprinting back out onto the street. He found a discount formal wear rental shop crammed between a liquor store and a dry cleaner. For the next 20 minutes, Terrence endured the absolute humiliation of standing in a cramped fluorescent-lit fitting room, stripping off his ruined custom suit and forcing his sweating body into a cheap, heavily starched polyester tuxedo. The jacket was tight across his shoulders, the fabric smelled sharply of industrial cleaning chemicals, and the trousers' hem hovered awkwardly above his ankles. It was the physical manifestation of his utter defeat. He paid the rental clerk his last wrinkled bills, walked out into the fading light, and began the long, desperate trek toward the Ritz-Carlton. Across town, high above the chaotic streets, I stood perfectly still before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my master suite. The woman staring back at me was a stranger to the Vanguard Solutions corporate circle, but she was the truest version of myself. For 6 long years, I had intentionally played the background. I had deliberately purchased muted off-the-rack dresses from mid-tier department stores. I had smiled politely at agonizingly dull corporate dinners, keeping my voice low and my opinions entirely to myself. I had purposefully dimmed my own light so Terrence could project his massive, fragile ego across the room. I let him boast about his leased cars, his inflated bonuses, and his fabricated networking success. I played the role of the quiet, supportive wife because it kept him completely blind to my actual power. Tonight, the shadows were gone. I reached onto the velvet dress form and slipped into a custom-made emerald silk gown. The heavy, luxurious fabric draped flawlessly across my figure, dropping into a sweeping, elegant train. The cut was bold, striking, and unapologetic. It was a dress that commanded total, absolute attention. It screamed of old money, immense private wealth, and unbothered grace. I secured a pair of genuine diamond drop earrings, catching the brilliant sparkle in the vanity lighting. I was not just attending the Vanguard Solutions annual executive gala. I intended to own the room. I intended to stand directly in the center of the grand ballroom as the architect of Terrence's complete public destruction. My phone chimed softly from the marble vanity. I picked it up and tapped the screen. It was a single encrypted text message from the private bonded courier service I had hired. Package is secured. Vehicle is in transit to the Ritz-Carlton. Scheduled delivery confirmed for exactly 8:30 p.m. I smiled, locking the screen and sliding the phone into a sleek metallic clutch. The timing was absolute perfection. 8:30 was exactly when the chief executive officer would take the stage to introduce the regional sales awards. It was the exact moment Terrence was scheduled to step up to the microphone and address the entire company. I turned off the vanity lights, walked out of my penthouse, and stepped into the private elevator. My town car was waiting downstairs. It was time to watch the empire fall. Miles away from the glittering downtown skyline, the heavy reinforced steel doors of the Federal Holding Facility groaned open. The muggy, oppressive evening air hit Jasmine like a physical wall as she stepped out onto the gritty pavement. She stood alone under the harsh yellow glow of the security floodlights, clutching a clear plastic bag containing her phone, her keys, and her empty wallet. She had just burned her absolute last lifeline. When the federal agents raided Chloe's fake boutique and dragged Jasmine out of her luxury apartment, she knew her legitimate front was completely compromised. She had spent the last 8 hours sitting in a freezing concrete interrogation cell, refusing to speak while the reality of her situation settled in. She was facing decades in federal prison for narcotics trafficking and money laundering. To get out of the holding facility, she had to liquidate a highly classified emergency crypto wallet. It was a hidden digital stash she kept completely separate from the boutique laundering scheme, specifically for catastrophic emergencies. She drained the entire wallet to pay a predatory bail bondsman. The transaction left her utterly, absolutely penniless. Jasmine ripped open the plastic bag and powered on her cell phone. She stood on the sidewalk, ignoring the passing traffic as her notifications flooded the screen. She went straight to her messages, searching frantically for Terrence's name. She checked her secure messaging apps. She checked her missed calls. She checked her voicemail. 0. Terrence had not called. He had not sent a lawyer. He had not arranged for her bail. The man who had spent the last 6 months whispering promises of luxury vacations, buying her expensive cars with stolen corporate funds, and swearing he would leave his wife for her, had completely ghosted her the second the federal authorities kicked the door down. He had cut her loose, leaving her to take the entire massive fall for a criminal enterprise he had helped finance. A cold, dark, homicidal rage crystallized in Jasmine's chest. She gripped the phone so hard, her manicured acrylic nails dug painfully into her own palms. Terrence thought she was just a naive girl he could use for a thrill and discard when the heat arrived. He thought he could abandon her to the federal justice system while he retreated to his safe corporate life. She opened her calendar app, scrolling back through the weeks of texts and digital invitations. She stopped on a specific date. Friday. Today. Jasmine's eyes narrowed as she stared at the screen. Terrence had bragged endlessly about this specific Friday. He had boasted about the Vanguard Executive Gala. He had told her how important he was, how he was receiving a massive regional award, and how he was going to take her to Paris the weekend after he secured his new promotion. He had sent her the digital invitation to show off the venue, the Ritz-Carlton. Jasmine did not have a dollar to her name. Her accounts were burned, her stash was gone, and federal agents were actively dismantling her life. She had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Terrence abandoned her in a cage, and now he was putting on a tuxedo to drink champagne and accept a corporate award. Jasmine stepped off the curb and aggressively flagged down a passing yellow cab. She yanked the back door open and slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated fury. She leaned forward, gripping the plastic divider separating her from the driver. "Take me to the Ritz-Carlton," she ordered, her voice trembling with cold, violent anticipation, "and drive fast." The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a suffocating ocean of wealth, privilege, and corporate vanity. Crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceilings cast a warm golden glow over the sea of Vanguard Solutions executives. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne roasted filet mignon and the low, steady hum of strategic networking. Waiters in pristine white coats glided across the carpeted floor, carrying silver trays of champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. It was the exact type of high society environment Terence had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to conquer. Tonight, however, Terence was not conquering anything. He was drowning in plain sight. I stood in the shadowed archway of the mezzanine balcony looking down at the spectacular train wreck unfolding near the center of the room. Terence was sweating profusely. His cheap, heavily starched polyester rental tuxedo was a visual nightmare amidst a sea of bespoke Italian wool. The jacket bunched awkwardly tightly across his shoulders, while the trousers hovered a full 2 inches above his scuffed rental shoes. He reeked of industrial dry cleaning chemicals and blind panic. Every time a senior partner or a board member approached him to offer preemptive congratulations on his regional sales award, Terence flinched. He offered erratic, forced smiles, his eyes darting frantically toward the massive double doors at the front of the ballroom and then toward the discreet service entrances at the back. He had no idea what time it was because he no longer had his massive gold watch to check. He was completely flying blind, running purely on the terrified adrenaline of a cornered rat. Off to the right side of the room, lingering near the premium open bar, I spotted Brenda and Andre. Their presence was a testament to the absolute delusion that governed their family. Andre looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. He was gripping a glass of bourbon, staring blankly at the floral centerpieces. His wife was currently sitting in a freezing federal holding cell, wearing an orange jumpsuit and facing decades for money laundering. Yet Andre had still put on a suit and showed up to a corporate gala because Terence and Brenda had likely bullied him into maintaining the family facade. Brenda, on the other hand, was operating in a state of aggressive clinical denial. She wore a heavy beaded gown that reflected the chandelier light aggressively working the room, as if she had not just been threatened with the demolition of her beloved church community center hours earlier. She was laughing loudly, clinking glasses with the wives of other executives, and pretending her family was the absolute pinnacle of black excellence. She was holding on to her fabricated status with a white-knuckled death grip, refusing to acknowledge the inferno raging right behind her. It was time to take my place on the board. I stepped out of the shadows of the mezzanine and walked down the grand, sweeping staircase leading directly to the main ballroom floor. I had spent 6 years making myself completely invisible at these corporate events. I had worn muted colors, sensible shoes, and quiet smiles specifically designed to let Terence absorb all the ambient light. I had played the role of the humble, supportive wife to absolute perfection because it kept him arrogant and completely blind to my actual capabilities. Tonight, the invisibility cloak was permanently retired. I was wearing a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that moved like liquid glass. The fabric clung to my silhouette, dropping into a dramatic sweeping train that demanded space. The plunging neckline and the sharp architectural cut of the shoulders projected pure, unadulterated power. I wore my hair slicked back, revealing genuine diamond drop earrings that caught the light with every step I took. I was not just a guest at this gala. As the lead forensic auditor who had just saved Vanguard Solutions millions of dollars in stolen assets, I was the most powerful person in the building. The moment my heels hit the main ballroom floor, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. Conversations naturally died down as heads turned in my direction. The wives who usually ignored me stared in open shock. The senior executives who only knew me as Terence's quiet +1 respectfully parted ways, clearing a direct path for me through the crowd. I glided across the carpet, heading straight for the Vanguard 5 IP table, situated directly in front of the main stage. The table was draped in black velvet and lined with platinum charger plates reserved exclusively for the award recipients and the senior board members. Before I could even reach out to pull out my chair, Brenda stepped directly into my path. Her forced smile was completely gone, replaced by a mask of pure venom. She moved to block my access to the table, grabbing my arm with a harsh, pinching grip. "What are you doing here, Camille?" Brenda hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the surrounding executives could not hear. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. After everything you have done today, after what you did to Chloe, and the lies you told about Terrence, you have the audacity to show your face at his award ceremony. You are going to ruin his night. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now before I have security escort you off the premises. I did not break eye contact. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then looked slowly back up into her eyes. My expression was completely terrifying in its calm. "Take your hand off me, Brenda," I said softly. She hesitated, but the cold authority in my voice forced her fingers to uncurl. She dropped her hand, taking a slight step backward, but her chin remained defiantly raised. "You do not belong at this table, Camille," she whispered furiously. "This table is for Vanguard executives and their supportive families. Terrence earned his seat here. You are just trying to steal his spotlight because you are bitter." I offered her a slow, genuinely amused smile. I reached into my emerald clutch and pulled out my heavy metal platinum card, turning it over in my fingers. "You seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of how corporate philanthropy works," Brenda, I replied, my voice carrying just enough volume for the adjacent tables to hear. Vanguard Solutions hired my forensic accounting firm to audit their books. As a gesture of professional goodwill and mutual partnership, my firm decided to fully sponsor the catering and the venue costs for tonight's charity gala. It is a massive tax write-off for my corporation. Brenda blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion as she struggled to comprehend what I was telling her. "I did not just get an invitation to this dinner, Brenda," I explained, leaning in slightly so she could smell my expensive perfume. "I paid for the dinner. I paid for the table you are standing next to. I paid for the crystal glass you are holding. I technically own this room until midnight." I raised my hand slightly and snapped my fingers twice. The head maitre d', a tall, imposing man in a sharp black tuxedo, materialized at my side instantly. "Yes, Ms. Camille," he asked, bowing his head with deep respect. "How can I assist you?" I looked directly at Brenda, watching the arrogant defiance completely drain from her face. "There seems to be a seating error at the VIP table," I instructed the maitre d', my voice perfectly pleasant and professional. "This woman and her son Andre are sitting in my reserved section. Could you please relocate them to a more appropriate area?" "Certainly, ma'am," the maitre d' replied. He turned to Brenda and gestured sharply toward the back of the ballroom. "If you and your party would please follow me." Brenda's mouth opened in silent horror. She looked around desperately, realizing that dozens of high-ranking executives and their wives were watching the exchange with keen interest. The public humiliation she so deeply feared was happening right in front of her. "Where are you moving us?" she stammered, her voice cracking. I smiled, gesturing gracefully toward the far opposite end of the massive ballroom. "I had them set up a very special table just for you and Andre," I said, my voice dripping with honey. "It is right by the swinging doors leading into the main kitchen. You might catch a draft when the waiters come in and out, but the lighting is very humble. I paid for the catering, Brenda. Enjoy the breadsticks." I turned my back on her before she could formulate a response. The maitre d' firmly guided a thoroughly mortified Brenda and a completely silent Andre away from the center of power, marching them across the entire length of the ballroom to a wobbly folding table hidden in the dark shadows near the service corridor. I took my seat at the VIP table, smoothing the silk of my gown perfectly unbothered. Across the room, Terrence had witnessed the entire exchange. He was standing near the grand entrance, his cheap tuxedo jacket hanging awkwardly off his frame. He watched his mother get banished to the kitchen doors, and he watched me take my seat at the seat of power. But he did not have time to process the humiliation. He was aggressively checking the large digital clock mounted above the bar. It was 8:22 p.m. The chief executive officer was scheduled to take the stage in exactly 8 minutes. The private bonded courier I had hired to deliver the massive audit dossier was due to arrive at any second. Terrence knew that if that sealed manila envelope made it to the head table, his life was completely over. He would be arrested on stage in front of his peers. Terrence spun around, abandoning his networking facade entirely. He shoved past a group of junior analysts, spilling a woman's champagne down her dress and ignoring her outraged gasp. He sprinted out of the main ballroom doors and bolted down the heavily carpeted hallway toward the hotel's rear service entrance. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a jackhammer. He skidded around the corner, nearly crashing into a brass luggage cart. He burst through the double doors leading to the hotel's rear security desk. He stopped dead in his tracks, panting heavily. Standing right in front of the security desk, arguing politely with the hotel guard, was a man wearing a dark gray courier uniform, holding a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope bearing the Vanguard Solutions corporate logo. Terrence felt a massive jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline explode through his veins. He had made it. He was not going to prison. He straightened his posture violently, yanking the lapels of his cheap tuxedo jacket, attempting to project the authority of a vice president. He marched directly up to the security desk, flashing his Vanguard corporate identification badge at the guard. "I am Vice President Terrence," he announced, his voice booming with forced confidence. "That package is highly classified corporate documentation for the Chief Executive Officer. He is currently preparing to take the stage and sent me out here to intercept it. I will take it from here." The courier looked at Terrence's badge and then at his sweaty, disheveled appearance. "I need a direct signature from a senior executive, sir," the courier stated, pulling a digital clipboard from his belt. "I am a senior executive," Terrence snapped, snatching the digital pen from the courier's hand. He scrawled his signature violently across the screen, thrusting the clipboard back into the man's chest. "Hand it over, now." The courier hesitated for a fraction of a second before relenting. He handed the thick, heavy manila envelope over the desk. Terrence grabbed the package with both hands. He felt the weight of the paper inside. He felt the thick wax seals securing the flap. A massive, overwhelming wave of absolute victory crashed over him. He had beaten her. Camille thought she was a mastermind, but she had underestimated his sheer will to survive. He had intercepted the audit. He had intercepted his own destruction. Terrence turned on his heel, clutching the heavy envelope tightly against his chest beneath his jacket. He marched back down the corridor, his stride completely transformed. The desperate cornered rat had vanished, replaced once again by the arrogant, untouchable executive. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom, stepping back into the golden light of the chandeliers. The string quartet was playing a lively crescendo. The crowd was moving toward their seats. Terrence walked straight down the center aisle, heading directly toward the VIP table. He did not look at the CEO. He did not look at the other vice presidents. He looked directly at me. I sat perfectly still in my emerald gown, resting my chin on my folded hands. Terrence stopped on the opposite side of the velvet-draped table. He stared down at me, a wide, triumphant, vicious smirk stretching across his face. He slowly pulled the corner of the thick manila envelope out from under his jacket, tapping it twice with his index finger, making sure I saw exactly what he was holding. He raised his eyebrows in a silent, arrogant challenge. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was safe. Terrence pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom and stepped back into the golden, glittering light of the crystal chandeliers. The string quartet was playing a lively crescendo, and the elite crowd of Vanguard Solutions executives was beginning to gravitate toward their assigned tables. Terrence walked straight down the center aisle, his stride completely transformed. The desperate cornered animal had vanished entirely, replaced by the arrogant, untouchable corporate titan. He clutched the thick manila envelope tightly against his chest beneath his cheap polyester rental jacket. The heavy wax seals pressed against his ribs, providing a comforting physical weight of absolute victory. He had beaten her. Camille thought she was a brilliant, untouchable mastermind, but she had severely underestimated his sheer will to survive. He had intercepted the private courier at the loading dock. He had seized the audit. He had single-handedly stopped his own destruction. Terrence reached the velvet-draped VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage. He did not look at the chief executive officer. He did not look at the other vice presidents. He looked directly at me. He stopped on the opposite side of the table, staring down at me with a wide, triumphant, vicious smirk stretching across his sweaty face. He slowly pulled the corner of the thick manila envelope out from under his jacket, tapping the paper twice with his index finger, making absolutely sure I saw exactly what he was holding. He raised his eyebrows in a silent, arrogant challenge. He slid into the empty chair right beside me, the scent of cheap dry cleaning chemicals and nervous adrenaline instantly invading my personal space. He leaned over his shoulder, deliberately bumping mine, projecting a false image of marital intimacy for the benefit of the surrounding board members. "You overplayed your hand," Terrence whispered, his voice a low, gravelly sneer aimed directly at my ear. "You actually thought you could hire some rent-a-cop courier to deliver my head on a silver platter." I intercepted it, "Camille. It is over. I have the files. You have absolutely nothing. Now sit there, smile, and watch me take the senior vice president title. Try not to look too bitter when the photographer comes around." I did not turn my head. I did not blink. I slowly raised my crystal flute of vintage champagne to my lips, letting the delicate bubbles dance across my tongue. I savored the taste, looking straight ahead at the empty stage, completely unfazed by his proximity. "I always enjoy watching you work, Terrence," I murmured softly, my voice perfectly level. "You put so much exhausting effort into the completely wrong details." Before he could process my response, the sweeping orchestral music abruptly faded into silence. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, casting the massive ballroom into a dramatic, theatrical twilight. A single brilliant white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the grand stage. The room fell into an expectant, hushed silence as the clinking of silverware and ambient chatter ceased entirely. Marcus Sterling, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Solutions, walked slowly to the acrylic podium. Marcus was an old money executive who had spent 40 years building a pristine, untouchable corporate reputation. Tonight, however, his shoulders were visibly tense. He looked pale, exhausted, and deeply furious. He adjusted the microphone, the sharp feedback echoing through the cavernous space. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice lacking its usual booming, jovial cadence. "Before we address the broader future of Vanguard Solutions, we must first recognize the regional performance of our sales division. I would like to call our Vice President of Sales to the stage to say a few words." Terrence practically vibrated with vindicated energy. He shot me one final venomous smirk before standing up. He buttoned his ill-fitting rental jacket, completely oblivious to how the cheap fabric pulled awkwardly across his chest, or how the trousers hovered above his ankles. As he walked toward the stage, polite applause rippled through the ballroom. He took the steps two at a time, striding to the podium like a conquering gladiator. He gripped the edges of the acrylic stand, looking out over the sea of executives, shareholders, and competitors. He was exactly where he believed he belonged. He was the center of the universe. "Thank you, Marcus," Terrence projected, his voice echoing with practiced, unearned charisma. "When I look out at this magnificent room tonight, I do not just see colleagues, I see family." Vanguard Solutions is an institution built on the unyielding pillars of loyalty, transparency, and relentless hard work. I took another slow sip of my champagne. The absolute audacity of the man was almost scientifically fascinating. Success is never a solo journey. Terrence continued, hitting every tired corporate cliché with sickening sincerity. It requires sacrifice. It requires a foundational commitment to doing what is right, even when no one is watching. We build this company brick by brick, invoice by invoice, knowing that our integrity is our most valuable asset. He paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. He searched the VIP table until the spotlight caught the emerald silk of my custom gown. "And of course, true success requires a strong foundation at home," Terrence said, his voice dripping with fabricated, camera-ready affection. "To my wife, Camille. You have stood quietly in the background for years, supporting my vision, managing our home, and allowing me to dedicate my life to this corporation. This impending promotion, this next chapter of our lives, is as much yours as it is mine." A warm, appreciative murmur swept through the ballroom. Several wives at adjacent tables offered me soft, sympathetic smiles, completely unaware of the radioactive tension radiating from my seat. I did not break eye contact with Terrence. I raised my champagne glass, slightly tipping the rim toward him in a silent, icy salute. Terrence nodded, soaking in the applause. He stepped back from the podium, turning to Marcus Sterling with an expectant, greedy expression. He was waiting for the ceremonial plaque. He was waiting for Marcus to announce his official elevation to senior vice president. Marcus did not move toward the trophy table. He stepped back up to the microphone. His face was rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. He gripped the sides of the podium, leaning heavily against the acrylic frame. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. The warm celebration evaporated, replaced by a sharp, uncomfortable tension. "Thank you, Terrence, for those inspiring words on transparency and integrity," Marcus said. The tone of his voice was dead flat, stripping the warmth completely out of the air. "They are highly relevant to the announcement I am forced to make tonight." Terrence frowned, his hands dropping defensively to his sides. He took a half step toward the CEO, confusion breaking through his arrogant facade. "As many of you know, tonight was scheduled to be a celebration of leadership transitions." Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping over the silent elite crowd. "However, there will be no promotions awarded today. In fact, there will be a complete restructuring of the executive board effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Hundreds of executives shifted in their seats, whispering frantically to one another. Terrence froze. His hand instinctively flew to his chest, pressing against the manila envelope hidden beneath his jacket. He had the files. The CEO could not possibly know anything. At 6 o'clock this morning, the board of directors was presented with a highly classified, rigorously authenticated forensic audit of our internal corporate accounts. Marcus stated, his voice ringing with barely suppressed fury. This dossier contained irrefutable, undeniable evidence of severe systematic financial discrepancies. Millions of dollars in corporate retention bonuses, vendor payouts, and offshore trust accounts have been actively embezzled from this company over the past 4 years to fund external illegal enterprises. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Shouts of shock and outrage echoed against the crystal chandeliers. Terrence stood completely paralyzed on the stage, the blood draining from his face so fast he looked like a walking corpse. He gripped his chest, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. If the board saw the audit at 6 in the morning, Terrence's mind raced, struggling to process the impossible reality. Then what did I just sign for at the security desk? Because of the sheer magnitude of this devastating theft, Marcus shouted into the microphone, fighting to be heard over the rising panic of the crowd. Vanguard Solutions was placed in immediate jeopardy. We were facing total insolvency and imminent federal seizure by Monday morning. Our accounts were compromised. Our legacy was utterly destroyed. Marcus turned slowly, aiming a look of pure, concentrated hatred directly at Terrence. Terrence shrank back, physically recoiling from the CEO's glare as if he had been struck. However, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding register that silenced the entire room once again. At exactly noon today, an emergency lifeline was extended. An independent private equity firm offered an aggressive, comprehensive buyout. They agreed to absorb our compromised debt, secure our remaining assets, and guarantee the continued employment of our innocent staff members. The board of directors had absolutely no choice. We voted unanimously to accept the acquisition. Terrence was shaking violently. His knees buckled slightly, and he swayed on his feet. He reached into his jacket with trembling, panicked fingers, pulling out the thick manila envelope he had intercepted at the loading dock. He ripped the heavy wax seals apart, tearing the paper in his frantic, mindless desperation. He pulled out the contents. It was not a federal dossier. It was not a forensic audit. It was a thick stack of completely blank white printer paper. Attached to the very front page was a single neon yellow sticky note. Written in my elegant, flowing handwriting was a simple, devastating message: "Look behind you." I would like to take this moment to introduce the savior of our corporation. Marcus announced, his voice echoing through the silent, breathless ballroom. He raised his hand, pointing directly past Terrence, past the stunned executives, and straight toward the VIP table. I would like to introduce the new majority shareholder of this firm, who personally funded the buyout, to save our jobs and completely eradicate the corporate rot within our ranks. Marcus extended his arm directly toward me. "Camille." The spotlight violently swung away from the stage, cutting through the darkness of the ballroom and locking directly onto me. The emerald silk of my gown blazed brilliantly under the intense white light. I did not stand up. I remained perfectly seated, my legs elegantly crossed, calmly holding my champagne glass. Terence let out a weak, pathetic wheeze. The stack of blank printer paper slipped from his trembling hands, fluttering and scattering across the polished wooden floor of the stage. He slowly, mechanically turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with a terror so absolute it bordered on madness. At that exact second, the massive state-of-the-art LED presentation screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage flashed to life. They did not display the Vanguard Solutions corporate logo. They displayed high-definition 30-foot-tall images of Terrence's forged invoices. They displayed offshore bank routing numbers highlighted in bright red. They displayed side-by-side comparisons of Vanguard corporate funds being directly wired into Chloe's fake lifestyle boutique accounts and Jasmine's illegal narcotic shell companies. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal was broadcast in brilliant, undeniable clarity to the entire room. The digital execution was absolute. The massive LED screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage did not display the familiar blue and silver Vanguard Solutions corporate logo. They did not show quarterly projections or motivational leadership quotes. Instead, they ignited with the cold, undeniable brilliance of my personal financial spreadsheets. The display was a 30-foot-tall monument to Terrence's absolute moral and legal bankruptcy. The documents were meticulously organized, chronologically color-coded, and cross-referenced with surgical precision. The entire ballroom of Atlanta's corporate elite stared in stunned, breathless silence as the undeniable proof of massive corporate theft was laid bare in high definition. In the upper left quadrant of the massive screen, a series of Vanguard corporate accounts were displayed, showing millions of dollars being systematically siphoned off over the past 4 years. Bright red arrows tracked the flow of the stolen capital directly into a web of offshore shell companies. But I did not stop at simply showing the theft. I traced the money completely through the laundering cycle directly to its final destinations. The center of the screen illuminated a long list of exorbitant lease payments for a luxury penthouse apartment in Midtown. Right beside the financial transfers was a clear copy of the lease agreement bearing Jasmine's signature alongside Terrence's forged corporate guarantee. The screen explicitly detailed the funds used to purchase imported Italian furniture, high-end designer wardrobes, and luxury vehicles, all paid for entirely with stolen Vanguard retention bonuses. Terrence had financed his secret second life using the salaries of the very employees sitting in the audience. The display then smoothly transitioned to outline Chloe's fraudulent operations. The spreadsheet illuminated the fake lifestyle boutique she used as a primary laundering front. Row after row of dummy invoices appeared showing massive purchases for inventory that never actually existed. The documents proved exactly how Terrence funneled Vanguard cash through Chloe's empty storefront, converting stolen corporate funds into seemingly legitimate retail profit. It was a textbook money laundering operation diagrammed so clearly that even a first-year accounting student could secure a conviction. Finally, the bottom right quadrant of the screen brought the devastation directly to the matriarch of the family. The spreadsheet highlighted a series of massive, lavish charitable donations made to Brenda's beloved church community center. For years, Brenda had paraded around her congregation, accepting awards, sitting in the front pews, and demanding absolute respect as a pillar of philanthropic grace. The screen revealed that every single dollar of her highly publicized vanity donations was entirely stolen from Vanguard Solutions. Brenda had bought her holy reputation with dirty, embezzled money. The initial silence in the grand ballroom shattered. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of attendees, followed instantly by a rising, deafening wave of outraged whispers and furious shouts. Silverware clattered against fine china as executives dropped their forks in sheer disbelief. Board members who had shaken Terrence's hand just 20 minutes prior now stared at the stage with expressions of absolute disgust and betrayal. The carefully curated atmosphere of the elite executive gala dissolved into utter chaos. Far across the room, near the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, Brenda stared up at the massive screens. Her name was glowing in bright, unforgiving letters next to the fraudulent church donations. The protective bubble of her aggressive clinical denial completely violently popped. The reality of her public exposure hit her like a physical blow. The women she had spent years looking down upon were now staring at her with open judgment and scorn. Her flawless holy reputation was permanently eradicated in front of the most powerful people in the city. Brenda let out a high-pitched, strangled wail. Her eyes rolled back into her head, her knees buckling beneath the heavy beaded fabric of her gown. She collapsed backward in a dramatic, dead faint, plunging directly into Andre's arms. Andre stumbled under her dead weight, catching her before she hit the carpet. He did not call for help. He did not look at his unconscious wife. He simply stared up at the screens, his face a mask of absolute paralyzed horror. He finally understood the complete rotting foundation his entire family was built upon. He was holding the physical embodiment of a lie. On the main stage, Terrence was undergoing a complete psychological breakdown. He stood frozen for 3 agonizing seconds, staring at the 30-foot-tall evidence of his federal crimes. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky gray. The cheap polyester rental tuxedo he wore suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. The triumphant, arrogant smirk he had worn just moments ago had entirely collapsed, replaced by the manic, panicked expression of a trapped animal. "This is fake!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he spun away from the screens to face the outraged audience. He waved his arms frantically, pointing a trembling finger at the display. "It is a fabrication. She hacked the system. My wife is a vindictive, pathological liar. None of this is real. I am the senior vice president. I saved this company." The crowd did not believe a single word. The evidence was too detailed, too precise, and overwhelmingly validated by the presence of the chief executive officer standing grimly at the side of the stage. Marcus Sterling did not intervene. He simply stood with his arms crossed, watching the man who had nearly destroyed his life's work completely unravel in real time. Terrence realized his words were failing. Blind, panicked adrenaline completely overtook his remaining sense of logic. He lunged wildly toward the side of the stage, scrambling toward the complex stack of audiovisual equipment powering the massive LED screens. He crashed into a heavy metal cart, knocking a stack of laptops onto the floor. "Turn it off!" Terrence roared, clawing frantically at the tangled web of thick black power cables. He grabbed a handful of wires and yanked with all his strength, trying desperately to rip the cords out of the projector matrix. He looked absolutely pathetic, a ruined, sweating man in a cheap tuxedo, violently fighting a machine he could not possibly defeat. He managed to rip one minor cable loose, sending a shower of sparks across the floor. But the main screens remained locked on an independent, secure feed. The high-definition evidence of his crimes continued to blaze brightly above him, refusing to go dark. I remained perfectly seated at the VIP table, the undisputed center of the storm. I did not flinch when Terrence began screaming. I did not move when Brenda collapsed by the kitchen doors. I slowly, elegantly crossed my legs, adjusting the draping of my emerald silk gown. I reached out and picked up my crystal flute of vintage champagne, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The cold, crisp bubbles danced across my tongue, tasting like absolute victory. I watched Terrence physically destroy whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. He was no longer a corporate titan. He was a cornered, desperate thief flailing in the dirt. Just as Terrence threw his body weight against the main power console, attempting to physically smash the equipment, the heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the grand ballroom were violently thrown open. The heavy thud of wood striking the interior walls echoed over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The immediate disruption caused heads to turn rapidly toward the entrance. Jasmine stormed through the archway and stepped directly onto the main center aisle. She looked absolutely nothing like the polished, glamorous mistress Terrence had kept hidden in the Midtown penthouse. The hours spent in the freezing federal holding cell had stripped away her carefully maintained facade. Her designer clothes were deeply wrinkled and smelled of stale sweat. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled and chaotic. Dark, thick streams of black mascara ran down her cheeks, cutting through her ruined makeup. Her eyes were wide, wild, and burning with a homicidal rage. She marched down the carpeted aisle, ignoring the shocked stares of the Vanguard executives. She did not care about the wealth or the prestige in the room. She only cared about the man standing on the stage, attempting to rip cables out of a wall. Terrence Jasmine screamed, her voice tearing through the cavernous ballroom with raw, unhinged fury. Terrence froze. He dropped the thick power cables he was gripping and slowly turned his head. He looked down the long center aisle and saw Jasmine marching directly toward him. The last remaining drop of hope evaporated from his soul. His secret life was physically colliding with his corporate reality. "You told me the money was clean! You absolute liar!" Jasmine shrieked, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at his face. "You swore the boutique was legitimate. You told me the imports were clean. You abandoned me in a federal cage to take the fall for your stolen corporate cash. You left me with nothing." Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped between the massive screens broadcasting his theft and the mistress broadcasting his betrayal. The crowd of executives parted hastily, stepping back from the center aisle to clear a path for the screaming woman. But as they moved aside, they revealed the final absolute nail in Terrence's coffin. Stepping through the open mahogany doors right behind Jasmine were three towering individuals wearing dark windbreakers. The bold yellow letters FBI were printed clearly across their backs and chests. They moved with silent, coordinated precision, stepping into the golden light of the crystal chandeliers. Their expressions were completely blank, totally immune to the elite corporate surroundings. The lead agent unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clink ringing out sharply in the sudden, absolute silence of the ballroom. Terrence stared at the federal agents. He looked down at the empty manila envelopes scattered at his feet. He looked up at the massive screens detailing his crimes. Finally, he looked across the velvet-draped table directly into my eyes. I smiled, lowered my champagne glass, and gave him a slow, graceful nod of farewell. The federal agents began walking down the aisle. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed like a judge striking a gavel. The three federal agents did not rush. They walked down the center aisle with the terrifying measured pace of predators who already knew all the exits were secured. The entire ballroom of Atlanta's elite fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic click of the agents' heavy tactical boots against the polished hardwood floor. Terrence's fight-or-flight instinct violently, completely overrode his rapidly deteriorating sense of logic. He looked at the agents. He looked at the massive 30-foot screens displaying his offshore routing numbers, and he looked at the horrified face of his chief executive officer. Terrence chose flight. He spun around wildly, his cheap rental tuxedo shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. He shoved violently past the VIP table, knocking over crystal water goblets and sprinting toward the side exit leading to the hotel lobby. He was moving with pure blind panic, his arms pumping desperately as he tried to escape the absolute reality of his destruction. He did not even make it 10 yards. The Vanguard corporate security team had been briefed by Marcus Sterling 10 minutes prior. Two massive security guards stepped out from the shadows of the side corridor directly into Terrence's path. Terrence tried to pivot, tried to alter his trajectory, but his momentum carried him forward. The lead security guard stepped into the charge, dropping his shoulder and driving his entire body weight directly into Terrence's chest. The impact lifted Terrence completely off his feet. He flew backward, soaring through the air before crashing violently into the towering 8-tier champagne fountain positioned near the edge of the dance floor. The destruction was spectacular. Hundreds of crystal champagne coupes shattered simultaneously in a deafening, explosive crash. A massive tidal wave of expensive vintage champagne washed over Terrence, completely soaking his cheap polyester suit. He lay gasping and thrashing amidst a mountain of broken glass and sticky alcohol, looking absolutely pathetic under the bright, unforgiving glare of the crystal chandeliers. The lead federal agent walked calmly over the sea of shattered crystal, his boots crunching loudly in the silent ballroom. He stood over Terrence's ruined, soaking wet form and smoothly unclipped his handcuffs. Terrence rolled over onto his side, spitting champagne and coughing violently. He pointed a shaking, bleeding finger directly at me. I was still seated comfortably at the VIP table, watching the scene with total detached amusement. "Arrest her!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking in a high hysterical pitch. "She set me up. She is a forensic auditor. She hacked my computer. She hacked the corporate servers and planted those files. She is the one you want. Arrest her right now." The lead agent did not even look in my direction. He reached down, grabbing Terrence by the collar of his ruined, soaked rental jacket, and hoisted him roughly to his feet. He spun Terrence around, slamming him face first against a decorative marble pillar and violently snapping the heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. "Terrence," the agent stated, his voice echoing clearly across the horrified ballroom, "you are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." Terrence let out a guttural, animalistic sob as the reality of the handcuffs bit into his skin. The surrounding Vanguard executives shrank back in complete revulsion, physically distancing themselves from the criminal in their midst. Near the center aisle, Jasmine realized the net was rapidly closing. Her initial homicidal rage toward Terrence had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate primal need to survive. She slowly began taking small, calculating steps backward, intending to slip out through the service corridor and vanish into the Atlanta night. She turned to sprint toward the exit, but a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder with vice-like force. A female federal agent stepped out from the crowd, her grip completely immobilizing Jasmine. "Let go of me!" Jasmine shrieked, twisting violently and thrashing her arms. "I have absolutely nothing to do with this. I am just a guest. You have no right to touch me." The agent swiftly pinned Jasmine's arms behind her back, securing a second pair of handcuffs with practiced, terrifying efficiency. "We have you on camera at the international airport, ma'am," the agent stated, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. "We have the footage of you attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with a duffel bag containing $400,000 in undeclared physical currency. You are coming too." Jasmine stopped fighting. Her shoulders slumped and she began to weep openly, the dark streaks of mascara staining her designer dress. I stood up slowly from the VIP table, smoothing the front of my emerald silk gown. I looked across the room toward the kitchen doors. Brenda was sitting on the floor, surrounded by discarded breadsticks, clutching her chest and hyperventilating as she watched her golden child get dragged through the ballroom in federal chains. The entire family was being publicly, completely disgraced in front of the exact high society elite they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress. The empire was officially dead. Exactly 7 days later, the brutal reality of the fallout had settled into the concrete foundation of my life. Terrence and Chloe were both sitting in federal lockup, entirely denied bail due to the sheer overwhelming weight of the financial evidence I had provided. Jasmine, realizing she was facing decades behind bars, had immediately taken a federal plea deal. She was actively singing like a canary, turning over every single contact, supplier, and hidden asset in exchange for a reduced sentence. I was standing in the foyer of my private downtown condo, sipping a cup of black coffee, when the security buzzer rang. I checked the monitor and let out a short, dry laugh. I opened the heavy, reinforced door to find Andre standing on my welcome mat. He looked completely destroyed. He had not shaved in days, his clothes were wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation and relentless crying. The bank had seized his joint accounts with Chloe, and the federal government had frozen every single asset tied to her fake boutique. He was completely, absolutely bankrupt. Camille Andre rasped, his voice trembling with desperation. "Please, you have to talk to the federal prosecutors. You have to tell them Chloe was just following Terrence's orders. You have to drop the civil charges. They are going to take the house, Camille. They are going to take absolutely everything. Chloe needs to come home." I leaned casually against the doorframe, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I looked at him with zero sympathy. I reached down to the console table and picked up a flattened, broken-down cardboard moving box. I tossed it directly at his chest. Andre fumbled, catching it awkwardly against his stomach. "You let your wife disrespect me in my own home." "Andre," I stated, my voice completely flat and dead. "You sat at my dining table eating food I paid for while your wife actively insulted my career and my intelligence. You both laughed while spending my money and financing your lifestyle with stolen corporate funds." Andre stared at the cardboard box, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "But we are family, Camille," he pleaded. "We were never family," I corrected sharply. "You have until exactly midnight tonight to get the rest of your personal belongings out of my Alpharetta property. If a single item is left inside that house at 12:01, I am having the locks changed and setting everything you own on fire." I slammed the heavy door directly in his weeping face, engaging the deadbolt with a satisfying metallic click. The Alpharetta property was just the beginning. The federal asset forfeiture had been ruthlessly efficient. Brenda stripped entirely of her prestigious church titles and totally excommunicated from her high society social circles due to the massive scandal, had lost the sprawling suburban townhouse Terrence had fraudulently purchased for her. She had been forcibly evicted by federal marshals 2 days prior. She was currently moving her remaining meager possessions into a tiny, completely run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. There were no chandeliers, no catered dinners, and absolutely no one left to impress. My phone rang, vibrating loudly against the marble kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed a generic toll-free number associated with the Regional Federal Detention Center. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Correctional Institution," the automated voice announced. "Do you accept the charges?" "I accept," I replied smoothly. Camille Terrence's voice came through the receiver, frantic, broken, and completely stripped of his former arrogance. "Camille, thank God you answered. Listen to me. The public defender they assigned me is an absolute idiot. He wants me to plead guilty. He wants me to take 10 years. You have to hire me a real defense attorney, Camille. You have to use the firm's money to get me out of here. I cannot survive in this place." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city. I listened to his pathetic, desperate breathing echoing through the prison phone line. "I am sorry, Terrence," I said, my voice light, airy, and completely unbothered. "I am having a really hard time hearing you right now." "What do you mean you cannot hear me?" he begged, panic escalating in his voice. "I am speaking directly into the phone, Camille, please." "I am sorry, Terrence," I repeated, smiling out at the skyline. "I just cannot hear you over the sound of the ocean." I ended the call, blocking the federal facility's number completely from my network. The final wrap-up of the Vanguard Solutions embezzlement scandal moved with terrifying judicial speed. The evidence I had compiled was so overwhelmingly precise that the defense attorneys had absolutely no room to maneuver. The sentences were handed down in a heavily publicized federal court hearing. Terrence received 8 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. Chloe, fighting through her arrogant tears, received 5 years for direct money laundering and accessory to fraud. Jasmine secured a reduced 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility for her total cooperation. The family's toxic, parasitic legacy was completely dismantled, burned to the ground, and scattered to the wind. 2 days after the sentencing, I was sitting comfortably in the spacious, luxurious leather seat of a first-class cabin. The flight attendant, a polite young man with a bright smile, handed me a warm towel and a menu. We were currently cruising at 35,000 feet directly over the deep blue expanse of the ocean. My final destination was a private, secluded, overwater villa in the Maldives. It was the exact, lavish, highly exclusive vacation Terrence had promised to take me on for years, while secretly spending our money to finance his hidden life. Now I was taking the trip myself, completely unburdened and entirely free. I opened my sleek silver laptop, connecting to the in-flight secure wireless network. I had one final piece of absolute business to conduct before I completely disconnected from the world. I opened the digital real estate portal, Following the federal seizure of Brenda's fraudulent townhouse, I had legally purchased the property at a massive government auction discount. I stared at the digital deed bearing my name as the sole proprietor. I attached the legal documents to a new email, drafting a message to a highly respected local charity organization. It was a foundation specifically dedicated to providing emergency housing and financial rehabilitation resources for women escaping severe financial abuse. I typed my digital signature, finalizing the total transfer of the property entirely free of charge to the charity. Brenda's beloved vanity home, the physical monument to her greed and entitlement, would now be used to rebuild the lives of women who had survived men exactly like her son. I clicked send, watching the progress bar complete. The flight attendant paused by my seat holding a silver tray. "Would you care for a glass of champagne before dinner, ma'am?" he asked politely. "I would love one," I replied, closing the laptop and setting it aside. He handed me a delicate crystal flute filled with pale, bubbling vintage champagne. I took the glass, holding it up toward the small, oval airplane window. I looked down at the endless, pristine white clouds floating peacefully over the dark ocean below. I gently clinked the crystal rim of the glass against the heavy, reinforced plastic of the window, a silent, solitary toast to my own survival. I took a slow, deep sip of the champagne, closing my eyes and letting the absolute profound quiet of the first-class cabin wash over me. Peace, I realized, smiling into the empty air, is incredibly profitable. The ultimate lesson from this story is that true power lies in silent preparation and unwavering self-worth. When surrounded by toxic individuals who underestimate and betray you, the best response is never chaotic anger, but calculated independence. Camille proved that you do not have to accept the role of a helpless victim or a background character in your own life. By focusing on the facts, quietly building her own security, and refusing to let her husband's deceit define her reality, she orchestrated her own flawless justice. True vindication comes from rising above the manipulation and letting the undeniable truth expose their lies. Hit the like button and share your own story of reclaiming your independence after a betrayal in the comments below.